"You're washed up, old man." The words cracked across the range louder than the rifles ever could. Laughter followed, sharp, echoing, cruel. Staff Sergeant Tyler Greaves grinned wide, his voice carrying over the open field. "If you can't keep up, maybe stay home where it's safe, huh?" A ripple of laughter moved down the line of young soldiers like wind through dry grass. Helmets shook, sleeves slapped, and for a moment the noise drowned out the sound of the summer wind. At the end of the bench stood Hank Morrow, 67 years old, shoulders slightly stooped, jaw firm, eyes the color of worn steel. His hands rested on an old rifle that looked like it had survived a war, because it had. He didn't speak, didn't even lift his eyes, just adjusted the sling, slow and exact. The leather creaked under his fingers. Someone in the back muttered, "He's shaking." Another replied, "Probably from age." A third laughed, "Hope he doesn't pull the trigger and snap his wrist." Their laughter was hollow, but it filled the air. Hank's hand trembled once, then steadied. He drew in a breath through his nose, quiet but deliberate. The sun caught the silver at his temples. Dust drifted around his boots like memory. He raised the rifle, not to aim but to clean a smudge on the sight. His movements rehearsed, patient, practiced. The kind of patience only earned through years of doing something for reasons younger men forget to understand. Greaves folded his arms, still smiling. "Come on, Grandpa. Let the real soldiers handle this." Somewhere behind the line, a metal chair scraped against concrete. The sound made Greaves glance up, just long enough to see someone watching from the shade of the tower. No laughter came from there, just stillness. But not everyone was laughing. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Hank Morrow moved like a man accustomed to waiting. He didn't shuffle or stumble, but neither did he hurry. Each step carried a deliberate patience, as though time was something he no longer chased. He walked the gravel range path alone, the sun warming his shoulders through the thin cotton of an old olive field shirt. His boots were worn smooth at the heels, not from disuse, but from decades of honest wear. He carried no phone, no badge, just a long, scuffed wooden crate under one arm and a folded shooting mat over the other. Dust clung to the legs of his pants. Behind him, younger men shouted across the range, energy bouncing between them like sparks off concrete. They moved in quick bursts, loud, broad, urgent. Hank didn't flinch. He stopped near the first bench, set the crate down gently, and knelt. His left knee locked up partway through the motion, and he grimaced. Not from pain exactly, but from muscle memory that didn't fire as fast as it used to. Still, he didn't brace himself, didn't call for help. His hands, rough and calloused, guided the latch open with care. Inside the box was his rifle. It wasn't shiny, and it wasn't black. The walnut stock had lost most of its varnish, smoothed over by rain, sweat, and sand. The scope was old-school glass, hand-zeroed and worn silver around the knobs. Its name, Martha, was scratched lightly beneath the trigger guard, barely visible unless the light hit just right. He didn't polish it, didn't pose with it. He just checked the chamber, lifted the bolt, and began wiping the receiver down with a faded cloth that smelled faintly of solvent and tobacco. He did not speak. Not to the recruits, not to the officers milling behind the line. His world was within the 3 feet of that bench, a quiet perimeter made of routine and memory. 8 years, every third Saturday, rain or shine. He was always here before the instructors, always the last to leave. He logged rounds fired on a leather-bound notebook, neatly folded in half at his station. No one had ever seen him use a calculator. His penmanship looked like it had come from a naval ledger. Block letters, perfect spacing, never hurried. A captain once asked why he still came. Hank had only said, "Because not everyone makes it back. I did." Someone called from across the range, a young voice straining to be heard over the noise. "Morrow, you sure you're cleared for this range?" Hank didn't look up. He simply lifted one hand, a nod, not a wave, then returned to adjusting the windage knob with slow, steady fingers. No fanfare, no reply. The heat pressed down across the field. Somewhere, a lawnmower droned far off. A red flag rippled faintly on the range tower. Staff Sergeant Greaves sauntered past, laughing with two of his squad members. He didn't acknowledge Hank. None of them did. But Hank had already seen them. Every inch of their posture. Every flick of false bravado. He'd seen it before. Not here, but in places where it didn't come with laughter. He checked the stock placement once more and ran a finger along the cheek rest. His breath was even, controlled, like a man measuring time in inches, not hours. He didn't speak a word, but today, something would be different. Hank stood beside the open crate, quietly arranging the rest of his tools with the precision of someone who had never forgotten the value of order. Each item had its place. A small brush, an old tin oil bottle, a folded cloth with dark edges, and a stubby flathead screwdriver wrapped in electrical tape. He laid them out like ritual offerings. Nothing flashy, nothing new, but all reliable. His right boot shifted slightly in the gravel as he balanced his weight off his knee. The motion was stiff, slow. His joints whispered their age beneath his skin. Still, his hands moved as if time hadn't passed at all. The recruits had gathered at a nearby table, their laughter trailing like smoke. Some leaned on the edge of the bench with their backs to him, their elbows spread wide. One of them, tall, square-jawed, with mirrored sunglasses reflecting the scorched range ahead, mimed an exaggerated limp. His knee jerked outward with every step as he paraded behind Hank's back. "Hey, look," the recruit said, grinning at his buddies. "Field exercise, Jurassic sniper." Laughter rolled over the gravel. It wasn't loud anymore. It was just easy, casual, the kind of mocking that never came with a second thought. Hank didn't turn. He heard it all, but he kept his gaze on the bolt group in his hand, gently brushing away invisible residue. The light above caught a faint scar across the back of his thumb, a white crescent, smoothed with age. It twitched once, then stilled. Another recruit leaned in closer to Greaves, his whisper more than audible. "Why's Grandpa lecturing us? We already passed qualification. This ain't story hour." Greaves snorted, arms crossed over his vest. "Probably thinks we're here for history class." The group chuckled again, but there was less edge this time. Just momentum, a shared language of youth feeding off each other's comfort. The oldest in the bunch might have been 24. At the front of the line, Hank began arranging the targets by hand. Small white silhouettes, their paint dulled by sun and time, laid neatly in a canvas roll. He unstrapped each one with quiet care. His breath was even, focused, paced with intention. He placed the first one gently at the 100-yard mark, walked back, then set another for the 200. His stride wasn't long, but it was exact. Heel down, toes straight. A rhythm like marching slowed to contemplation. Behind him, one of the recruits knocked a live round from the edge of the table. The brass case spun in the dust and landed with a small puff beside Hank's boot. No one moved. Hank knelt, slower this time, his left leg resisting as he dipped. He picked up the round, wiped it once with his shirt cuff, and returned it to the table without a word. His thumb lingered on the rim before he let go. "Man, takes him 10 minutes just to pick something up," a voice murmured. Hank remained still for a second longer than needed, then turned and walked back to his bench, unbothered. Sergeant Greaves stepped forward, a smirk curling across his face. "We'll take it from here, old man. We're training for the real thing." There was no venom in his tone. That was what made it sting more. It wasn't personal, just dismissal, a brush of irrelevance. Hank nodded once. No argument, no pride to defend. He stepped back from the bench, removed his mat from the ground, and folded it over his arm. His fingers were slow in the creases, not because he struggled, but because he didn't rush. Like everything else he touched, it had to be done properly, or not at all. From a distance, someone adjusted a camera on a tripod. A low beep echoed off the hillside. The sound of a screen door clapping shut came from the small operations hut behind the tower. The wind picked up, tugging the hem of Hank's shirt and carrying with it the faint scent of oil and pine needles. Another round clattered to the floor. No one reacted this time. Hank turned slightly, eyes scanning the field. For a moment, it looked as if he might speak. His mouth opened, then closed. He bent again, retrieved the round, and placed it precisely beside the other. The recruits kept talking. "Probably thinks he's some kind of war hero," one said. "Yeah? From what war?" "The Revolutionary." More laughter. Not one man reached down to help him. Not one asked what unit he'd served in. Not one saw the shadow in his eyes. And still, Hank said nothing. The wind shifted just enough to lift the edge of Hank's shirt as he stood at the side of the range, now several paces back from the active firing bench. His arms hung at his sides, hands relaxed but ready. He watched as the recruits settled into their stances, checking sights, adjusting shoulder stocks, cracking jokes under their breath. None of them looked his way. His presence had faded into the background. Like an old signpost, no one bothered to read anymore. Greaves slapped a fresh magazine into his rifle and raised his voice, addressing the group with theatrical flair. "All right, gentlemen, let's have a little fun before lunch. Accuracy challenge. Steel targets, 300 yards. 3 shots. No scopes. Let's see what kind of sharpshooters we've got." Cheers rippled through the squad like heat off the gravel. One recruit pumped his fist. Another tapped his buddy on the helmet, already claiming victory. Then Greaves turned. He didn't need to speak loudly now. He just pointed. A casual gesture toward Hank, who stood motionless beneath the bare flagpole. "Tell you what," Greaves said with a grin. "Let's give the museum piece a chance. Grandpa Morrow, you want to show us how they did it back in the black and white days?" Laughter erupted, louder than before, open now, almost mean. One of the younger recruits leaned down, mimicking a cane, wobbling across the line as if his legs couldn't hold him. Another added sound effects, wheezing breaths, rattling coughs. Hank didn't move. His face didn't change, but his fingers, hanging at his sides, closed gently into fists and opened again, just once. "I'm serious," Greaves continued, feeding off the energy. "Come on, Hank. Take a shot. One last ride for the old-timers." Someone behind him shouted, "Let him use his walker as a bipod." A boot scuffed the gravel. Then a dusty, faded baseball cap flew through the air, landing near Hank's feet. It skidded in a lazy arc, coming to rest with the brim bent inward and a small puff of dirt rising around it. "Oops," the thrower said, grinning. "Guess this belongs to the Smithsonian." Hank looked down at the cap. His face didn't flinch, not even a blink. He bent slowly, picked it up, brushed the dirt from the brim with one firm stroke, and set it gently on the bench behind him. The motion was exact, quiet. He adjusted the cap once more, smoothing the fabric over the bill, then turned back to the line. For a moment, the laughter faltered. A quiet edge slipped into the air, sharp as the heat shimmer rising off the pavement. A junior officer, barely older than the recruits themselves, cleared his throat nearby. His voice wasn't loud, more uncertain than firm. "Hey, maybe dial it back a bit. Show some respect." Greaves snapped his head toward him, still smiling, but there was steel in his eyes now. "This is training, Lieutenant," he said flatly. "Not story time." The officer said nothing more. He backed away, half embarrassed, half ashamed. He wouldn't speak again for the rest of the session. Hank remained silent. He looked past the row of recruits, past the shooting line, out toward the far targets barely visible in the summer haze. His breathing stayed slow, controlled. He didn't turn, didn't sit. He stood there like a marker driven into the ground, unmoved by noise or heat. The recruits took their shots, one by one. Steel clanged at the edge of the range as rounds struck. A few missed, a few laughed off their aim, some celebrated. But none of them looked back at the man who stood motionless behind them. Not once. And still, the old sniper didn't flinch. Hank stepped away from the bench with no words exchanged, no lingering glance over his shoulder. The shooting continued behind him, but the sound of it dulled the farther he walked, swallowed by the dry wind and the hush of pine needles underfoot. A low hill flanked the range on one side, and at its base stood a wide-armed pine tree with a rusted bench pressed into the ground beneath it. Hank made his way there, slow but steady, lowering himself into the seat, as though it were a ritual, not a retreat. He exhaled slowly once he sat, a breath more measured than weary. The light caught the side of his face, leathery and lined but not tired. His eyes remained sharp, flicking from tree to sky to distant steel target, as if tracing equations only he could see. He pulled a small canvas bag from beneath his folded shooting mat, unzipped it, and laid out his tools once again. From the bottom came an old metal tin, square, olive drab, its corners dented from years of use. The latch clicked softly open, and he pulled out a cleaning cloth, a tube of lubricant, and a folded photograph worn to a near blur. He didn't look at the photo for long, just long enough to remember. Two young men, crouched in jungle foliage, muddy but smiling, one with a cigarette between his fingers, the other, unmistakably Hank, 35 pounds lighter, helmet pushed back, grin caught mid-laugh, squinting into the sun. No caption, no date. The memory didn't need one. He tucked the photo away, adjusted his grip, and began to dismantle his rifle with care. The motion was instinctive, not just from repetition, but from reverence. He moved like a man tending to something sacred. The bolt came out. The chamber was checked again. The cloth passed once over the barrel, smooth and precise. The wind tugged at his shirt, but he ignored it. The world could be loud. He had long since learned to work in silence. Back on the range, a shot rang out, followed by a loud whoop. One of the recruits had struck steel, and the squad hollered in approval. Greaves shouted something about natural talent. Another shot followed. This one missed, but the laughter didn't stop. For them, it was still a game, a contest of noise and bravado. Hank didn't even glance back. He rubbed a bit of carbon from the bolt face, then dabbed oil into the grooves with the tip of his pinky finger. His motions were as fluid as they were slow, the kind of slowness that came not from age but from discipline. Every step was deliberate. Every stroke of the cloth was even, without tension. When he placed the bolt back into the action, it slid home with a quiet click that was almost lost in the distance. But to Hank, it might as well have been thunder. That click had once meant the difference between breathing and not, between going home and staying behind. He didn't flinch at the sound. He just nodded once, as if answering a question only he had asked. The sun shifted, edging down behind the hill, casting longer shadows across the gravel. The steel targets shimmered in the late light, heat bending the air between them and the line. Hank lifted the rifle and sighted down the range, not to shoot, just to look. Through the aged scope, the world came into focus the way it had always done. One eye closed, one breath drawn in, left hand wrapped around the stock, cheek resting just above the weld. Everything stilled. For a moment, the noise behind him didn't matter. For a moment, it was just the wind, the rifle, the steel, and the ghost of a shot not yet taken. From the tower, a figure watched him, unmoving, hidden behind dark sunglasses and a stilled cup of coffee long since gone cold. And someone else had noticed. Captain Lila Mendoza hadn't touched her coffee. It sat cooling on the rusted ledge of the range tower's observation deck, untouched since the morning's first shot. The chipped white mug bore the crest of her old unit, a faded emblem from her time in the United States Marine Corps. The wind teased at her collar, ruffling the pressed fabric of her uniform blouse. But she didn't move. Her eyes, hidden behind black-tinted glasses, stayed fixed on the man beneath the tree. She hadn't come to watch him. The training had her attention, or at least it had been supposed to. But somewhere between the laughter and the smug cadence of Greaves's voice, she had turned her gaze away from the firing line and toward the old man with the rifle. She hadn't known his name until she saw it scratched into the volunteer sign-in log that morning. Hank Morrow. No rank listed, no branch, just a quiet signature in neat, all-capital letters. From her vantage point, she could see everything. The slow, practiced way he had assembled his tools, the subtle shake of his left hand when he reached for the bolt, the way he breathed before pulling it back. Not labored, but disciplined, controlled, like someone who had taught himself to move past pain without ever pretending it wasn't there. Below her, the range buzzed with energy. Recruits jostled each other at the bench, arguing over target placement and bullet groupings. Greaves paced like a man who needed to be seen. Loud praise followed a decent shot. Loud complaints followed a missed one. Every success was a celebration, every failure a joke. But Hank didn't laugh, and Mendoza watched how he didn't. A recruit approached the base of the tower, pausing just long enough to glance upward. "Ma'am," he called, voice casual. "Is that guy even cleared for this range? He's slowing stuff down." Mendoza didn't answer at first. Her head tilted slightly, but her mouth stayed closed. She kept watching the man beneath the tree as he dabbed a drop of oil along the receiver and wiped it clean with a circular stroke. Then she looked down at the recruit. "Keep your focus on your group," she said evenly. The recruit hesitated, then turned and walked back toward the others. She returned to her observation. Hank had finished reassembling the rifle. He rested it across his lap like something living. Not a weapon, not a relic, but an extension of himself. His thumb traced a faint groove along the top of the stock, worn smooth by years of contact. He sat with his spine straight and his gaze far. She couldn't place it at first, but something about his posture told her everything. That stillness, that silence, not resignation, not fatigue. It was something else, something deeper, like the weight of a story that didn't need to be told to still be felt. And she had seen it before, not in textbooks or on parade grounds, but in old hospital rooms, in folded flags handed off to quiet hands, in the eyes of men who had lived through things they never needed to explain. She picked up the coffee mug, lifted it an inch, and set it back down without drinking. Her fingers tapped once against the rim. She hadn't planned to intervene, but then came the shot. The air on the range had begun to change. The sun had slipped lower, casting a dull golden light across the field that flattened every edge and soaked the gravel in the long shadows of the surrounding pines. The sharp voices of the recruits had dulled as their competition thinned. Each man had taken his turn. Some had missed completely. Some had found metal and let out triumphant cries. Greaves had made his show of things. Loud, confident, laughing louder when his final shot struck dead center. 300 yards, clean through, he called, turning toward the squad with arms raised like a prize fighter. I doubt anyone here's topping that. Applause followed, but it wasn't real. It was automatic, the clapping of men who didn't want to be the next target of sarcasm. Greaves basked in it anyway, soaking in the spotlight as if the sun itself had waited just to highlight his aim. Then Mendoza's voice broke through, steady, clear, and low. "Mr. Morrow." The applause stopped. Heads turned. Hank didn't lift his gaze immediately. He was still seated beneath the tree, the old rifle resting across his knees like a remembered tune. But he heard her. He always heard what mattered. She took a few steps down from the tower, her boots deliberate against the metal stairs. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. "Would you like to take the last shot?" Silence fell. For a moment, it was as though the entire range held its breath. The heat hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Greaves glanced at his squad, his smile faltering for the first time. A few of the younger recruits exchanged confused looks. "Is she serious?" one whispered. Hank stood slowly, not in a rush, not with drama, just a quiet unfolding of his frame as he lifted himself upright and brushed dust from the front of his pants. The rifle came with him, held with familiarity, not flourish. His boots pressed into the gravel with the soft crunch of weight that knew where it was going. He walked the length of the range, unescorted, uninvited, but now undeniably seen. No one spoke as he passed. He arrived at the bench without adjusting anything. No measurements, No calculations. He simply placed the rifle down with care, folded the shooting mat once more, a single crease, and knelt beside it. His left knee locked again with resistance, but he did not wince. He lowered himself all the way to the prone position, elbows pressing into the ground like anchors. A gentle wind picked up, brushing loose sand across the range. Hank adjusted the sight, not with hesitation, but precision. He checked the rear iron, then looked through the front, aligning the shot the way he had done 1,000 times before. The world narrowed to a tunnel. The sight, the steel target, the stillness between heartbeats. Behind him, the squad watched. Mendoza folded her arms. Greaves tilted his head slightly, trying to read something in the way the man lay behind the rifle. But there was nothing to read. Hank gave them nothing. No smirk, no stare. Just breath drawn deep into lungs that had once known jungle heat and jungle fire. He exhaled. Then, without a word, he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out like a hammer across an anvil. Not louder than the others, but heavier, cleaner. A single sound with no echo, no sway, no wasted movement. At 300 yards, the steel target spun once, then settled, dead center. The small red marking at the core of the silhouette had vanished, torn clean through. For several seconds, no one moved. Then a whisper. Bullseye. Another. Dead through the eye. Hank rose slowly, pressing up from the gravel with the same deliberate care he used to set the rifle down. He didn't speak. He didn't look for applause. He just dusted his palms together, picked up the weapon, and walked back toward the pine without once turning to face the group behind him. No one else came close. The shot still echoed somewhere in their bones, even though the range had fallen silent. Hank had long since returned to the bench beneath the pine, but no one on the line had resumed talking. No jokes, no laughter, just the soft click of one safety being re-engaged, and the subtle scrape of a rifle being laid down with care, not bravado. Greaves stood stiff near the front of the bench, arms no longer folded, his mouth slightly open as he stared down the range at the steel target. He blinked once, then again, as if trying to find something wrong with what he had just seen, but there was no denying it. The hole in the red mark was clean, a perfect center shot at the maximum qualifying distance, done without fanfare, without optics, and without hesitation. A recruit leaned in toward another, whispering in the voice of someone who hadn't yet found his way back to normal. How the hell did he do that? The other shook his head slowly. Didn't even flinch. From her position near the tower, Captain Mendoza stepped forward. Her hands were behind her back, her posture straight but relaxed. She stopped at the edge of the firing line, close enough to speak without raising her voice. She didn't look at the recruits. She didn't look at the target. Her eyes were on Greaves. "You just got bested by a man who hasn't fired in years," she said softly, almost like an afterthought, not meant to shame, only to state a truth that had already arrived. Greaves didn't answer. His jaw worked once, but the words didn't come. Back beneath the tree, Hank sat again. He wasn't looking at anyone. His rifle rested across his knees as before, his hands folded neatly on top of it. His breath came slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. His eyes were fixed on something far off, past the targets, past the trees, past even the heat wave haze that shimmered along the earth. There was no triumph in his posture, only presence. And presence was enough. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, one of the recruits stepped back from the line and sat down on the gravel, rifle across his lap, head tilted toward the earth like a student who had just understood the lesson without ever being told it. Others followed, not because they were told to, but because something unspoken had shifted in the air, because some part of them knew, without understanding exactly why, that they had just witnessed something sacred. It was not about skill. It was about steadiness, stillness, silence under pressure, precision earned through a kind of suffering no classroom could replicate. A few feet behind the group, a younger instructor turned toward Mendoza, voice quiet but full of realization. "Who is he?" Mendoza didn't answer right away. She let her gaze return to Hank, sitting with the weight of years across his shoulders and a stillness that refused to bow to time. When she finally spoke, her voice was nearly reverent. Someone who never had to prove anything, but did anyway. Then she stepped forward again, her boots stirring dust as she crossed the line toward the old man beneath the pine, and she asked him a question only a real soldier would know. The late light slid down the range like honey, softening the edges of everything it touched. The ridgeline, the steel targets, the gravel beaten flat by boots. The wind had slowed. The last shot had passed. And still, Hank Morrow sat beneath the pine tree with his rifle laid across his lap like an old photograph come to life. He hadn't moved in minutes. Not because he was tired, but because stillness had long ago become his answer to the noise of the world. Captain Mendoza approached quietly. Her boots left small puffs of dust with each step, but she didn't speak until she reached the edge of his shadow. There was no authority in her voice, no rank, just curiosity, and something else, something closer to reverence. "Didn't you serve in the Highlands?" she asked. 1971? Hank didn't look up right away. His gaze remained on the range as if watching something that no longer existed but still echoed in his bones. After a moment, he nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "Ghostback Ridge." The name settled into the air like ash. Mendoza said nothing for a beat, then sat on the bench beside him, the wood creaking beneath her. "My father used to talk about that place," she said. "Said it wasn't a ridge. Said it was a nightmare with wind." Hank let out the faintest breath, not quite a laugh. He wasn't wrong. Wind so high it howled through your helmet straps. Couldn't hear your own heartbeat out there. He paused, eyes narrowing on the distant steel plate at the end of the range. Spent 5 days pinned under dead brush with a broken scope and a sprained wrist. Ate half a can of peaches and half a cigarette. Waited for the right shot. Only got one. Mendoza didn't interrupt. She knew better. She'd grown up in a household where stories weren't given. They were earned, like folded flags, and quiet nights filled with silence that wasn't empty. "My father told me there was a sniper out there," she said. "Took a shot no one believed. Saved a full platoon before the airlift. No name, no medal. Just one shot." Hank finally turned toward her, not quite facing her, but enough that their eyes met in the half-light. "Wasn't just one," he said softly. "There were others. They didn't make it home." She held his gaze a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod. Not of confirmation, but of acknowledgement. From behind them, the recruits had gathered closer, no longer loud, no longer smirking. A few stood with their rifles held respectfully across their chests. Some had taken a knee. Greaves stood in the back, his arms by his sides now, his head slightly lowered, as though the very earth beneath him had shifted without warning. He took a step forward. "Wait," he said, more to himself than anyone else. That was him? Hank didn't answer. He didn't need to. The wind stirred once more, lifting the pine needles above him, and for a moment the air smelled faintly of cordite, sun-baked rations, and the heavy heat of jungle mud. The men who had mocked him couldn't look away. The range had never been quieter. No orders barked, no rifles cracked. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. The recruits stood as if uncertain what to do next, their earlier bravado stripped away by something older, deeper, heavier than embarrassment. They had witnessed something they could not explain, and now they stood in the echo of it, faces turned not toward medals or instruction, but toward a man who had never asked for anything. Captain Mendoza turned back to the group. Her stride was steady, not rushed. She moved to the front of the formation, her shadow stretching long behind her, her voice firm, not raised, not scolding, but unmistakable in its authority. "From this moment forward," she said, "any veteran who volunteers their time on my range will receive your full respect, not because you're told, but because it's earned and has already been paid for, in full." She let the silence hang. No one interrupted. No one dared. Her gaze swept over the men. Each one straightened under the weight of her words, not from fear, but because they knew she was right. Greaves shifted from foot to foot. He was no longer at the center of anything. He looked smaller now, not weak, but stripped of certainty. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as if searching for something to hold that wasn't pride. He stepped forward, slowly. Not a swagger, not a stomp. Just a man walking toward another, unsure how to begin. He stopped a few feet from Hank, who still sat beneath the pine tree. His cap was now pulled slightly down, casting a shadow across his face. He hadn't moved to meet the moment. He didn't need to. The moment had come to him. Greaves stood silent for a beat, then cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, then caught himself. "I mean, Mr. Morrow. I didn't know." Hank didn't lift his eyes. He just spoke low, even, like someone who wasn't angry, only tired of being misunderstood. "You didn't ask." Greaves nodded slowly. No protest, no defense, only truth. He looked down, then extended his hand. It hung in the air for a second before Hank looked up, read his face, and finally shook it. Not tightly, not warmly, but firmly. One of the recruits stepped forward next, rifle slung across his back. He offered his own hand, eyes down. Then another came, and another. Soon they weren't lined up by rank or by squad, but by understanding. Behind them, Mendoza returned to the small operations shed and pulled out the range log, a thick binder, corners bent, pages worn from years of sign-ins and volunteer rosters. She flipped to the current page, lifted her pen, and without pause, wrote across the margin, H. Morrow, Permanent Honorary Instructor. There was no ceremony, no salute, just ink on paper and a quiet that meant more than applause. And though Hank said nothing, he held his rifle a little differently now, not prouder, not taller, but with the calm of a man who had waited years to be seen and had finally been looked in the eye. But Hank wasn't done yet. 1 week later, the sun rose over the training range the same way it always had. Slow, bright, indifferent. The gravel still crunched under boots. The steel targets still lined up in the distance, waiting to be tested. But something was different now, though no sign had been hung, no speeches given, no protocol revised in bold print. It was in the way the young soldiers moved, quieter, more measured, less for show. Hank was already there. He sat beneath the same pine tree, in the same rusted bench, his rifle case unopened beside him. A spotting scope was set up in front of him now, the tripod legs sunk slightly into the soft dirt. His hands rested on his knees. His breath matched the rhythm of the wind. He didn't need to command the space. His presence was enough. This time no one questioned why he was there. This time, when the recruits filed in, they didn't jostle for attention. They nodded to him, a few quietly, a few with full eye contact and a hand on the brim of their cap. One young man offered him a fresh bottle of water and set it down beside the bench without a word. Another simply left a small, folded cleaning cloth near his rifle case. These were not gifts. They were acknowledgments. Captain Mendoza stood at the edge of the range tower, arms folded, watching the shift unfold. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The lesson had already been taught. Now it was simply being lived. Greaves walked toward Hank from the opposite side of the line. He didn't carry his usual swagger. His hands were occupied, one holding Hank's old shooting mat, the other gripping the handle of the metal tin. When he reached the bench, he placed both items down carefully. "You left these," he said, voice low. Hank looked at them, then up at the man. Greaves wasn't apologizing anymore. He was participating. "I figured," Hank said, then added after a pause, "Appreciate it." The two men stood there for a long second, not in silence exactly, but in something better, understanding. Then Greaves nodded once and returned to the line, calling out the range commands with a calmer tone than he'd used the week before. Midway through the morning, a new recruit whispered toward the man beside him as Hank adjusted the scope beneath the tree. "Why's the old guy here?" Greaves didn't look up as he loaded a round into the chamber. "That man could outshoot you blindfolded," he said. "Watch and learn." No more was said. As the day wore on, Hank leaned into the scope, calling out slight wind corrections for those who asked. His voice never rose. It barely carried, but each word landed like guidance, not instruction. A routine began to form. At the end of each training session, the last shot of the day was fired not by the loudest voice or the fastest hand, but by whoever Hank pointed toward. He didn't explain his choices. He didn't need to. And those chosen never took it lightly. The tree remained his post. The mat remained folded unless unfolded with purpose. The rifle stayed closed unless opened with intent. And so, a new rhythm took root, not written into manuals or ordered by command. It was grown in the soil of quiet respect, day by day, without announcement, without obligation. A tradition was born. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.